The wagon came down the north road just before dusk, and Eli Marsh saw it from the ridge above his timber lot. One horse, one driver, a flatbed hauler with iron-shod wheels and no cargo. That alone made him lower his axe. In the winter of 1871, no one drove an empty wagon into the Alleghenies unless they were lost or desperate, and the man on the bench did not look lost. Eli wiped the sap from his hands and started down the slope. His breath hung white in the cut. Around him lay 40 red oaks he had felled since the first frost, all of them meant for the mill at Coldwater Creek, and none of them moving. His mule had gone lame in October. His brother, who had promised to help haul, had taken a job on the railroad and never come back. The logs sat where they fell, half buried under 3 inches of new snow, and every day they lay there was a day closer to spring rot. The stranger halted the wagon at the bottom of the trace and stepped down. He was a lean man of maybe 40, brown coat, brown hat, a beard trimmed close. He carried himself like someone who had walked a long way to get where he stood. "You'd be Marsh," he said. "It was not a question. I would. I'll haul your timber for free." Eli set the butt of his axe on a stump. He waited for the rest. "All of it," the stranger said. "Down to the mill, no pay, no barter. I ask only one thing in return. When I've finished the haul, you let me winter on your land. Not in the house. I'll build my own shelter. You won't feed me, you won't lend me a thing. Come spring thaw I'll be gone, and you'll owe me nothing." Eli looked at the wagon, he looked at the man. He looked at the 40 oaks bleeding sap into the snow. "Why?" he said. The stranger's eyes were pale gray, steady as slate. "Because I need a piece of ground that faces north and holds a spring." "You've got both, that's enough payment." There was no honest answer to that. A north-facing lot with a live spring was worth less than half the value of hauling 40 logs 8 miles through winter roads. Eli knew it. The stranger knew it, which meant the stranger was either a fool, a fugitive, or something else entirely. Eli had a wife inside the cabin, a boy of 9, a daughter of 6, and a pantry that would not stretch to March. He did not have the luxury of pride. "Start tomorrow," he said. The stranger nodded once and drove his wagon down to the flat by the creek, where he unhitched his horse and built a small fire and slept beside it under a wool blanket, though the temperature that night dropped to 11 degrees below zero. Eli watched him from the cabin window. He did not sleep well. The man's name was Jonas Weld. That was all he offered. No town, no trade, no family. When Eli's wife Margaret asked at breakfast where he had come from, he said, "East," and cut his cornbread into small, careful pieces. When the boy Samuel asked if he had fought in the war, Jonas said, "Some men did. I dug." That was the end of that. He hauled from first light to full dark. The road down to Coldwater Creek was steep and rutted, and treacherous with ice, and a lesser driver would have lost the wagon on the first grade. Jonas did not. He walked beside the horse on the descents, one hand on the brake pole, the other on the harness, and he took each turn as if he had driven it 100 times before. In 4 days he had hauled 12 logs. In 8 days he had hauled 24. In 12 days the whole cut was down at the mill, and Rufus Coldwater himself had paid Eli in silver coin and asked twice where he had found the stranger. "He found me," Eli said. Rufus scratched his neck. "Man like that don't work for free. Watch your smokehouse." But nothing was stolen, nothing was disturbed. On the 13th day Jonas came to the cabin door with his hat in his hand and said, "I'll begin on the shelter tomorrow. I'll need to borrow no tools, I've my own. I'll take timber only from the deadfall in the North Hollow, if you'll permit it." "Take what you need," Eli said. "Deadfall only," Jonas repeated as if the distinction mattered. He walked out into the North Hollow that afternoon and did not return until after dark. When Margaret carried a lamp to the window, she saw him standing at the edge of the spring, ankle-deep in the snow, holding a plumb line against the slope. "What in God's name is he measuring?" she said. Eli did not know. The next morning Jonas began to dig. He did not fell a single standing tree. He did not raise a single wall. He took a mattock and a long-handled shovel and a wooden pail, and he cut into the north-facing bank above the spring, and he began to remove earth. By the end of the first day he had opened a hole the size of a grave. By the end of the second day he had opened a hole the size of a root cellar. By the end of the third day Eli could not see him from the cabin at all, because Jonas Weld was working entirely underground. Samuel, the boy, could not stay away. He crept down to the hollow every morning with a heel of bread and stood at the lip of the pit and watched. Jonas never chased him off. He answered the boy's questions when the boy asked and ignored him kindly when he did not. "Why so deep?" Samuel asked on the 4th day. "Because the earth doesn't freeze past a certain line," Jonas said. He was chest-deep in the pit, shoveling in even strokes. Below that line the ground stays the same temperature all winter and all summer, about 50 degrees hereabouts. You dig below the frost and you're never cold and never hot again, so long as the walls hold. How deep is the frost? 4 feet. Sometimes 5. In a hard year, I'll go 7 to be sure. Why 7? Because I want a floor and I want a bench above the floor, and I want the bench above the frost line by 2 full feet. Cold air sinks. It'll pool at the floor and leave the bench warm. That's the trick of it. Samuel did not understand half of what Jonas said, but he understood the tone. It was the tone of a man who had done this before. He ran back to the cabin and told his father, and Eli walked down that evening and looked into the pit himself. It was rectangular, 8 feet by 12, and the walls were dressed as square as a mason's cellar. At the north end Jonas had cut a shelf into the earth, waist high, wide enough for a man to lie on. At the south end he had opened a narrow channel that ran downhill toward the spring, angled just enough for water to drain away and not back. "You mean to sleep on the ground," Eli said. "I mean to sleep above the ground," Jonas said. "With the ground around me. The damp will kill you. The damp will not touch me. I'll show you why if you want to see it." Eli said he wanted to see it. Over the next week, Jonas Weld built things Eli had never seen a man build. He cut cedar poles from the deadfall and laid them across the pit as rafters, close enough that a fist could not pass between them. Over the cedar he laid a course of split saplings, and over the saplings a course of birch bark peeled in long ribbons, and over the birch bark a thick layer of dry meadow hay he had cut and stacked in September on some other man's land, hauled here in the empty bed of his wagon on the last leg of his journey. That hay was why he had come with an empty wagon. Eli understood it only then. Over the hay Jonas laid sod, not turf cut fresh and wet, but sod cut from a south slope and left to cure so it was matted with root but light. He laid it grass side down first, then a second layer grass side up, so the finished roof looked, from 10 paces away, like a small rise in the hillside and nothing more. From 20 paces it did not exist at all. Inside, along the north wall of the pit, he laid stone, not the pretty stones of a hearth but flat river rock the size of a man's chest, dragged one by one from the creek on a sled he built in an afternoon. He set them in 2 courses, mortared with a paste of clay and ash he mixed in the wooden pail. The stones ran the full length of the north wall and stood 4 feet high. He left a hollow behind them, no wider than his hand. "For what?" Eli asked. "For heat," Jonas said, "and for something else, you'll see." At the far end of the stone wall Jonas cut a low arch into the earth and lined it with more rock, and at the mouth of the arch he set a small iron door he unwrapped from a bundle in his wagon. It was the only piece of manufactured iron he seemed to own. He handled it as another man might handle a Bible. "Stove?" Eli guessed. "Firebox. The fire will burn in there and the smoke will run behind the stones, along that hollow I left, and up through a flue at the far end. The stones will drink the heat. When the fire dies, the stones will give the heat back all night. I'll use 1 armful of wood where you'd use 5. "Russian trick," Eli said. He had heard of such things from a peddler once, years back, and never believed them. Jonas did not answer. He was fitting the iron door to its frame, and his hands moved with the quiet patience of a man who has done a thing so often he no longer needs to think about it. The cabin, meanwhile, had begun to fail. Eli had built it 7 years earlier with green timber and hurried notches, and every winter it had leaked heat like a sieve. This winter it leaked worse. The chinking crumbled at a touch. The north wall, which faced the wind, grew a coat of frost on the inside by mid-January. Margaret hung 2 quilts over it, and still the water pail froze 6 feet from the fire. Samuel developed a cough that would not leave him. The daughter, Ruth, cried in the night from the cold in her hands. Eli burned wood faster than he could split it. By the first week of January he had gone through half his winter cordwood and had not yet reached the deep months. He stood in the cabin one evening counting sticks in the wood box, and Margaret said, without looking up from her mending, "We will not make it to March at this rate." He knew it. He had known it for a week and had not said it aloud. "He offered to show me his shelter," Eli said. "Then go and see it." Eli walked down through the hollow that night with a lantern. The moon was new and the snow was blue and the wind cut through his coat as if the coat were paper. When he reached the spring he saw no light, no smoke, no sign of any dwelling at all. He might have walked past it if Jonas had not called out from the ground, "Down here, Mr. Marsh." The entrance was a narrow slot cut into the bank, angled so that the wind could not drive straight into it. A hide curtain hung across the opening. Eli pushed it aside and stepped down 3 earthen steps, and then a second curtain, and then he was inside, and he stopped where he stood. The air was warm. Not the fierce dry heat of a stoked fire, but a steady, even warmth that seemed to come from every direction at once. He could not see the fire. He could smell no smoke. A single tallow candle burned on a small table cut from a stump. The stone wall along the north side glowed faintly, with a heat he could feel on his cheek from 6 feet away. "The fire is out," Jonas said. He was sitting on the earthen bench with a book open across his knees. "It has been out 4 hours. 4. I light it once at dawn and once at dusk. An armful of wood each time. No more." Eli placed his hand against the stones. They were warm as a horse's flank. He moved his hand along the wall and felt the heat travel with him, even unbroken. "The whole 4 feet of the wall's height." "The floor," Eli said. "Cold at the floor," Jonas agreed. "That's where the cold air sits. You'll notice a man doesn't sleep on the floor of this house. He sleeps on the bench 3 feet up. Warm air rises. Cold air pools. If you fight that, you burn wood. If you build for it, you burn almost none." Eli sat down on the bench. It was covered with a wool blanket and a bearskin. The earth beneath it felt neither damp nor cold. He looked up at the ceiling. He could see the cedar poles, dark with pitch, and between them nothing but the black shadow of the hay above. "The roof doesn't drip," he said. "It won't drip. The hay above the poles is dry, and the sod above the hay sheds water before it ever reaches the hay. The birch bark between the sod and the hay is the seal. Birch bark won't rot. The old peoples of the north built this way for 1,000 years. I learned it from a man who learned it from a man who learned it from a Finn." "Why won't the walls sweat?" Jonas closed his book. "Because the walls are the same temperature as the air inside. Sweat comes when warm damp air touches a cold surface. In your cabin the air is warm and the walls are cold, so the walls weep. In here, the walls are earth, and earth below the frost line stays at 50 degrees all winter. The air in here settles to about the same. There is no difference for the damp to gather on, so the walls stay dry." Eli sat with that for a long moment. He thought of the frost on his own north wall. He thought of Margaret's quilts and Samuel's cough. "You could have told me this the day you arrived," he said. "I could have. Why didn't you?" Jonas looked at him with those slate-gray eyes. "Because a man who is told a thing does not believe it. A man who sees a thing built cannot forget it. I did not come here to give you a lecture, Mr. Marsh. I came here to build a shelter I needed for myself. If you wish to learn from it, you may. If you do not, you may not. That is your business." Eli went home that night and did not sleep. In the morning he walked back down to the hollow and asked Jonas Weld if he would help him do the same for the cabin. "I cannot rebuild your cabin in January," Jonas said. "The ground is frozen 4 feet down. But I can show you a smaller thing. A thing that will get you to spring." The smaller thing took a week. Jonas had Eli haul stone from the creek, the same flat river rock, and stack it against the inside of the north wall of the cabin, floor to ceiling, 2 courses thick. Between the stones and the timber wall he packed dry meadow hay tight so that no daylight showed through. Over the stones he tacked a canvas he cut from a wagon cover to keep the dust in. "The wall will still be cold to the touch," he said, "but it will no longer suck the heat out of your family. The hay will not let the cold pass. The stones will hold whatever warmth reaches them from the fire, and give it back through the night. You will burn less wood. You will sleep warmer. Your boy will stop coughing inside of a week." Samuel stopped coughing inside of 5 days. Eli's cordwood, which had been dwindling by armfuls, began to last. Where he had burned 3 logs to hold the fire through a night, he now burned 1.5. Margaret took down one of the quilts from the north wall and used it on Ruth's bed instead. The daughter slept through the night for the first time since November. But the cold, as Jonas had warned, was not finished. The first of the great storms came in the last week of January. Eli felt it in his teeth an hour before the wind rose. The sky went the color of lead. The horses in the mill valley bawled and would not be quieted. By nightfall the snow was falling sideways, and the wind through the pines made a sound Eli had never heard before, a low continuous groan, as if the mountain itself were bearing weight. The storm blew for 3 days. On the morning of the 2nd day, Eli could not open his front door. The snow had drifted to the eaves. He climbed out the window with a shovel and dug a trench to the woodshed and back, and when he was done he was so cold he could not feel his hands. Inside, the cabin held. The stone wall Jonas had built radiated a slow, steady heat from the fire Eli kept low but constant, and the north side no longer bled warmth. Margaret and the children slept on the floor by the hearth under every blanket in the house. On the morning of the 3rd day the wind fell. Eli went out to check on the animals in the lean-to. The chickens had lived. The goat had lived. The wood was holding. He stood in the terrible white silence and thought of Jonas Weld in the ground by the spring, alone, and he set off through the drifts to see whether the man was alive. The hollow was unrecognizable. The spring had frozen at its edges. The whole slope had been rewritten by the storm. Eli would have walked past the shelter entirely if he had not remembered the way the bank turned above the water. He kicked the snow away from where he thought the door should be, and he found the hide curtain, and he called out. "Come in," Jonas said. From 3 feet away on the other side of the earth, Eli went in. The shelter was warm. Not merely warmer than outside, not merely warmer than the cabin, warm. Jonas sat on the bench in his shirt sleeves mending a strap of harness, and a small pot of beans simmered on a stone by the firebox. The air was fresh. Eli could not understand how the air was fresh. "You've a vent," he said. "Two," Jonas said, "one low at the door, one high at the back. The cold air comes in low, sinks to the floor, warms as it rises past the stone wall, and leaves through the high vent, drawing the smoke up with it. As long as the fire draws, the air moves. As long as the air moves, no man suffocates. I checked it 3 times before I first lit the firebox. A man who does not check his vents dies in his sleep, Mr. Marsh, and no one ever knows what killed him." Eli sat on the bench. He thought of the storm outside and the way the wind had bent the pines and the way his own cabin had shuddered on its sills. And here in the ground there had been no wind at all, no draft, no groan of timber, nothing but the soft crackle of a small fire and the smell of beans. "You have done this before," he said. "I have done it many times." Where Jonas set down the harness. He looked at the fire for a long moment. "I dug graves in the war," he said. 4 years of them. 10,000, near enough. I learned the ground the way a farmer learns his field. I learned where the frost stops and where the water runs, and where a body will keep and where it will not. When the war ended, I could not go home. Home had nothing left in it, so I walked. And as I walked, I began to think that a man who understands the ground the way I understand it need never be cold again, need never burn a forest to keep a family alive, need never sit in a cabin in January and watch his children shiver." He picked up the harness again. "I have built 7 of these," he said. "From Pennsylvania to Missouri. I build one each winter for myself, and when I leave in the spring I leave it standing, and I tell the man whose land I built it on to use it as he sees fit. Some tear them down. Some use them for cellars. One man in Ohio moved his mother-in-law into hers, and she lived there 14 years, and outlived him. That one pleased me." "Why do you not settle?" Eli asked. "Because there is still ground I have not learned." Eli did not press him further. He understood, in the way one understands weather without reading it, that Jonas Weld was a man who had seen more of the earth in one condition than any man ought to see, and that the shelter in the ground was not merely a shelter. It was a small argument, built once each winter, against the memory of 10,000 graves. Eli walked home through the drifts and did not speak of what Jonas had told him, not to Margaret, not for years. February brought a false thaw. It came out for 2 days and the icicles ran, and Samuel and Ruth ran outside without their coats, and Margaret hung the blankets on the line. On the 3rd day the temperature dropped 40 degrees between noon and midnight, and every wet surface on the mountain turned to glass. A crust of ice, 1/2 inch thick, sealed the snow. The chickens could not scratch. The deer could not paw through to browse. The wolves came down out of the high country because the deer were weak and easy. Eli lost a goat to the wolves on the 6th of February. He heard it in the night and could not reach it in time. He sat in the snow beside the torn body in the moonlight and understood, in a way he had not understood before, how thin the line was between his family and hunger. The next morning Jonas Weld came up to the cabin for the first time since the haul had ended. He knocked at the door and stood on the stoop with his hat in his hand. "I heard a goat cry in the night," he said. "I am sorry for it. May I look at your stores?" Eli led him into the smokehouse. Jonas walked the length of it slowly. He looked at the hams and the salt pork and the strings of dried apples and the crock of lard and the barrel of cornmeal. He counted. He did not touch anything. "You will run short in the first week of March," he said. "Not badly, but short, I know it. Do you have a root cellar?" "Under the cabin. It froze in December. It froze because it is not deep enough, and because the door opens into the cabin, and every time you open it you let cold air fall down the steps. Cold air falls, Mr. Marsh. It always falls. If your cellar door is inside a warm room, the cellar becomes a bucket for the cold. Everything in it freezes. Everything you kept for winter is ruined by the winter." Eli had not known this. He had thought the cellar froze because the winter was hard. He had thought about it every winter for 7 years. "I have 3 weeks before I leave," Jonas said. "The ground by your east wall faces the morning sun. There is a natural swell there. If you will help me, I can open a new cellar into that bank with the door outside the cabin and a step down and a second door at the bottom. 2 doors, an airlock. The cold cannot fall past 2 doors. What you put in it in October will still be there in April. I cannot save the goat. I can perhaps save the next winter." They dug for 11 days. The ground was frozen for the first 3 feet and they broke it with fire, banking a slow blaze over the outline of the pit each night and shoveling out the softened earth each morning. Below the frost, the earth turned dark and easy. Jonas showed Eli how to angle the walls, how to leave a shelf of undisturbed earth for the potatoes, how to line the floor with sand for the carrots so they would not touch each other and rot from the touch. He showed him how to hang the hams so no two brushed, and how to leave a small clay dish of water on a stone by the door so a man could know, at a glance, whether the cellar was above freezing without going all the way in. "If the water is liquid, your food is safe," Jonas said. "If the water is skimmed with ice, open the inner door for an hour at midday and let the sun-warmed air in from the outer chamber. Never open both doors at once, never in winter, never, never." Eli said, as if committing a scripture. They roofed the cellar the same way Jonas had roofed his own shelter, cedar poles and split saplings and birch bark and hay and sod, and when they were finished, the whole thing looked, from the yard, like a low green hump against the east wall of the cabin. Ruth called it the Badger House. The name stuck. By the first week of March, Eli's cordwood had begun to thin, but not badly. Margaret's blankets were still on the beds and not on the walls. Samuel's cough had not returned. Ruth slept through her nights. The stone wall on the north side of the cabin gave back its patient heat every evening, and the fire in the hearth burned smaller than it ever had, and the smokehouse still held food, and the Badger House stood dark and dry and waiting for the next October. Jonas Weld came up to the cabin on the 12th of March. The snow had begun to thin on the south slopes. Water was running under the ice at the edges of the creek. He carried his bundle over his shoulder and his horse was harnessed to the empty wagon. "I'll be gone in the morning," he said. Margaret set a place for him at the table. He ate slowly and thanked her for each dish by name, and afterward he sat with Samuel for an hour and answered the boy's questions about the ground and the frost and the vents and the stones. He drew diagrams on a slate with a piece of chalk. Samuel kept the slate. He kept it his whole life. "The shelter by the spring," Eli said when the children had gone to bed. "What do you want done with it?" Jonas considered. "Use it as you see fit," he said. "It will stand 100 years if you keep the roof patched and the vents clear. Sod roofs want a new course of turf every 7 years or so, laid over the old. Do not let saplings root in it. Their roots will find the birch bark and split it. Beyond that, the shelter will ask very little of you. Will you come back?" "No," he said it without weight, the way a man notes the direction of a road. "There is a widow in Indiana who has written me a letter," he said. "Her husband was in my company. He did not come home. She has a farm and no cellar, and 3 children, and I have promised her a winter's work. After that, I do not know. There is a great deal of ground I have not learned." He left in the gray before dawn. Eli walked out to the wagon with him and shook his hand and could not think of a single thing to say that was equal to what had been done. Jonas seemed to understand. He touched the brim of his hat and clucked to the horse and drove down the trace toward the mill road, and the wagon was as empty as it had been the day he arrived. Eli stood in the yard until the sound of the iron wheels was gone. The rest of that spring came on quickly. The creek broke up. The oaks put out their small red leaves. Eli plowed the south field with a borrowed mule and planted corn and beans and a patch of squash for the Badger House. Word had begun to move through the valley that something had happened at the Marsh place through the winter. Rufus Coldwater rode up in April and looked at the stone wall inside the cabin and the Badger House against the east wall and the earth shelter down by the spring, and he took off his hat and stood in the doorway of the shelter for a long time without speaking. "That man was here for 4 months, Rufus said, "and he built you 3 winters? He built me for the rest of my winters," Eli said. By July, half the men in Coldwater Creek had come up to see. Eli did not turn any of them away. He showed them the stones and the hay and the 2 doors and the vents. He drew the diagrams Jonas had drawn on Samuel's slate. He explained, as best he could, why cold air falls and why warm air rises and why the earth 6 feet down does not care what the sky is doing. Some believed him, some did not. A carpenter named Hollis went home and dug a cellar the same way, and wrote Eli a letter in November thanking him for a barrel of potatoes that had not frozen in the coldest week of the year. The winter of 1872 was as hard as the winter of 1871. The cabin held. The Badger house held. Samuel, at 10, kept the fire in the firebox down by the spring and slept on the bench some nights just to prove to himself that he could. Ruth grew tall enough to reach the water dish by the inner door and check it twice a day without being asked. Margaret took the last of her wall quilts down and cut them into a coat for the boy. They did not hear from Jonas Weld again. A peddler passing through in the spring of 1874 said he had known a man of that description in Missouri who had built a winter shelter for a widow and moved on toward Kansas. Another said the same man had been seen in Nebraska in 1876. A third said he had died in a place called Ash Hollow of a fever, in a house he had built himself, warm to the last. None of them could be verified. Eli did not try. What could be verified was this: the shelter by the spring stood for 61 years. Eli's son Samuel used it as a spring house for his cheese, and Samuel's son used it as a place to keep his mother's dahlia bulbs through the winter, and Samuel's grandson, when he was a boy in the 1930s, used it as a hiding place from his sisters. The stone wall inside the cabin was still standing when the cabin was pulled down in 1948 to make way for a state road, and the men who pulled it down remarked that the north wall had been drier than any wall they had ever taken apart. The Badger house against the east wall was still in use until 1952, when the family bought an electric refrigerator and the cellar was filled in with gravel. Though, even then, Samuel's grandson said he was sorry to lose it. The slate with Jonas Weld's diagrams was donated to a local historical society in 1961 by an elderly Samuel Marsh, then 89 years old, who insisted, over the objection of the archivist, that the drawings were not folk art but engineering, and that any man in the county who was cold in the winter had only himself to blame. The slate is still there. The diagrams are faint but readable. They show a pit 7 feet deep, a bench 3 feet above the floor, a stone wall running the length of one side with a hollow channel behind it for the smoke, a firebox at one end and a flue at the other, a low vent and a high vent, a roof of poles and bark and hay and sod, and at the entrance, 2 doors with a step between them. Beneath the last diagram, in a hand that is not Jonas Weld's but a boy's, is written, "Cold falls, warm rises, earth remembers." That was the whole of what Samuel Marsh took from the winter of 1871. He wrote it in his own hand at the age of 10, in chalk that has since been fixed under glass, and it is, in 3 sentences, the reason a stranger drove an empty wagon up the north road at dusk and offered to haul 40 logs for free, and stayed the winter in the ground and left in the spring, and was remembered. The whole town learned why he came by the end of that year, and by the end of the next, and by the end of every winter that followed for a long time after. He had come to prove, quietly and without fee, that a man who understands the ground need never be cold again. And in a small hollow on a north-facing slope above a live spring in the Alleghenies, for 61 years, the ground remembered that he had been right.